The island lay in the southern Aegean, roughly circular, a low cone of dark stone rising from a sea that ran clear over white sand close to shore and deepened to violet a short way out. In the late spring of any year in the second millennium before the present era, the slopes of the central peak held the last of the winter green, and the lower terraces, cut by hand into the volcanic soil, carried the new leaves of the vine and the silver underside of the olive. The town stood on the southern coast, on a ridge of harder stone above a shallow harbor, and from its upper windows the line of Crete could be seen on clear afternoons as a long shadow on the horizon, 2 days of sailing to the south. To the north rose the cone of the central peak, broad-shouldered and even, with a single low plume of vapor that rose from its summit and bent eastward in the prevailing wind. To the west, the ground dropped through terraced fields to a smaller bay. To the east, a low headland sheltered the harbor from the open sea. The land had been settled for a very long time before the Bronze Age town reached its full extent. The earliest occupation on the ridge dates to the late Neolithic, around 4,500 years before the present era, when the first small houses were built of unworked stone and mud, and the first fields were broken out of the volcanic ash that covered the lower slopes. That ash, the product of older eruptions long predating any human memory by the time the first farmers arrived, was unusually fertile, and it held water through the dry season in a way that the limestone of the neighboring islands did not. The vine took to it, the olive took to it, the barley and the emmer took to it. By the early Bronze Age, perhaps 2,500 years before the present era, the small houses had become a small town, and by the time the principal phase of the excavated buildings was constructed, the town had become substantial. The climate was, and remained, dry and mild. The winters were rainy and short, the summers long and almost without precipitation, and the wind through the warmer months blew from the north and the northwest, cooling the buildings and carrying the smell of brine and dust through the open windows of the upper stories. The rainfall of a single winter, captured in cisterns cut into the soft pumice and lined with plaster, was enough to last the household through the dry months, supplemented by water drawn from springs at the foot of the ridge. The growing season ran long. The same field could be sown in autumn, harvested in early summer, and turned for a second crop before the rains returned. Around the island lay other islands, in a loose ring and a long arc to the north. The nearest of them was a half-day of sail at the most, the farthest a full day under a steady wind. To the south, Crete; to the north, the smaller Cyclades, low and rocky, set in the same blue water; to the northeast, the long curve of the Anatolian coast; to the west and the northwest, the Greek mainland with its mountains visible on the clearest mornings. The town stood at a point on the sea where every one of these landfalls was reachable in something between a day and 3 days, and where the prevailing winds set themselves to carry boats outward in summer and home again in autumn. The harbor below the town was shallow and protected, with a beach of dark sand on which boats could be drawn up, and a low rocky promontory at its mouth, where the wind caught the sail of an approaching vessel and slowed it for the final approach. The harbor is gone now. The cone of the island erupted in the 17th century before the present era, and the harbor, the beach, the promontory, and a substantial portion of the ridge itself were carried out to sea, replaced by the great open caldera that fills the view to the north from the modern village. But in the centuries of the town's principal occupation, the harbor was the doorway of the place. The view from the upper windows took in the line of the harbor, the lines of the moored boats, the line of the path that led down from the town gate to the beach, and beyond that the open water and the line of the horizon. The soil under the town was the same soil as the soil of the surrounding fields, dark, light in the hand, mineral, and warm in the sun. it was easy to dig. The town's drains, cisterns, and storage pits had all been cut into it, and the original builders of the houses had worked with the soil as a building material in addition to as a foundation. Mud brick, mixed from the soil and straw and dried in the sun, made the upper courses of the walls. The lower courses were of stone, cut and laid in regular blocks, the upper of mud and timber and plaster. The houses rose above the streets in 2 and sometimes 3 stories, and from the higher windows the eye traveled out across the terraces, the harbor, and the line of the sea, all the way to the horizon, in any weather and in any season. The light on the island was particular. The volcanic dust held it. In the morning the eastern slopes turned a pale gold, the harbor below shaded to a deeper blue, and the white plaster on the upper walls of the town took the color of new ivory. By midday the light flattened, the colors paled, the white of the plaster became an even, almost shadowless field, and the dark soil of the fields held the heat of the sun like a fired floor. In the afternoon the light slanted again, the western slopes turned, the shadows lengthened, and the upper windows of the town turned, one by one toward the sea, taking the last of the day before the long fall into evening. Within the town the streets ran narrow and straight, paved with flat stones laid edge to edge, and beneath them, set into a continuous trench cut down into the soft volcanic rock, the covered sewer of the place carried wastewater and rainwater alike out toward the harbor. The streets were not wide enough for 2 carts to pass. The heaviest goods moved by pack animal and by hand. Houses lined them in continuous rows, sharing walls along their flanks, with their entrances opening directly onto the paving, and their upper stories oversailing the street on a course of timber corbels. The total area of the excavated quarter is approximately 1.5 hectares, and the excavation has revealed neither a perimeter wall nor a central public space of the kind a later Greek town would have had. The town was a town of houses, of streets, and of small squares formed where 2 or 3 lanes met. The houses themselves were tall standards of the period. Most were of 2 stories, several preserved to a third. One, by the careful reading of the surviving stair, may have risen to a 4th. The ground floor was of cut stone, the lower courses of dressed ashlar set without mortar in regular bond, the upper courses of smaller rubble bedded in a clay and lime mortar. The masonry was good, the corners were squared. The lintels were of timber, of cypress and of fir and of olive, and occasionally of imported cedar, set into the masonry with care and finished to a smooth face. Plaster covered the inner walls of the principal rooms. Some of the exterior walls were also plastered and painted, though most of that exterior color has not survived. The upper stories were lighter in construction than the ground floor. Walls were built in a half-timbered manner, a frame of horizontal and vertical beams filled with mud brick and finished with plaster on the interior and the exterior. The beams were laid in regular bays, and the floors above were of plaster on a bed of reeds and beams. Stairs ran up against an interior wall, cut in stone for the first flight and in timber above. The roofs were flat, made of beams and reeds, and a layer of clay packed and rolled smooth. Drainage from the roofs ran through clay pipes set into the wall and out through small openings at the level of the street, into a separate channel from the sewer below. The ground floor rooms of most houses were given to work and storage. Magazines, narrow rooms lined along one wall with the great storage jars known as pithoi, held grain and oil and wine and pulses. The pithoi stood the height of a standing adult and were so heavy when full that they had been set in place during construction and the walls then completed around them. Workshops occupied other ground floor rooms, a weaver's space marked by clusters of loom weights along one wall, a bronze smith space marked by the residue of slag and the patches of burned floor where the small forge had stood, A potter's space, marked by the partial fingerprints in unfired clay set aside for the next firing. The upper stories held the rooms in which the household lived. These rooms were finished. The plaster ran smooth. The walls were painted, in some houses, with frescoes that covered every wall from floor to ceiling. The principal room of a larger house held a hearth, a low bench along one wall, a doorway opening to a narrow corridor and to other rooms beyond. Light came in through window openings on the long side that faced the street or the sea. The windows were taller than they were wide, set without glass, closed at need with wooden shutters that pivoted on bronze pins. Plumbing was unusually developed for the period. Lavatories on the upper stories of several houses connected by clay pipe to the covered sewer running beneath the street, and fresh water was carried in by hand from cisterns and springs, and stored in great jars in the courtyards. Some houses preserved small ceramic basins set into the floor of the upper rooms, fed by a clay pipe from a cistern above, and drained by another pipe through the wall to the sewer below. Bathing, washing of vessels, and the disposal of waste were managed in this way, and the streets were kept clean by the same system. Color was important. The interior plaster of the principal rooms was finished in pale grounds, and on these grounds the painters of the town worked in red and yellow ochre, in lampblack, in a brilliant blue ground from copper and silica that the Egyptians made and the Therans imported and used sparingly, and in a deep red made by burning ochre to a richer shade. The colors were laid down while the plaster was still wet, the buon fresco method, so that the pigment bound into the lime as it cured. This is the reason the frescoes survive at all. The pigment is now part of the wall. The buildings themselves were of human scale. The doorway was the height of a tall, standing adult. The room was the width of 3 or 4 strides. The upper stories were reached by a flight of 9 or 11 or 13 treads, and the windows were set so that an adult standing in the upper room could lean on the sill and look out across the street to the next house, or across the terraces to the harbor, or up the slope to the cone of the central peak. The proportions are the proportions of houses that were built to be lived in, by people who had been living in houses of approximately the same kind for many generations. In the upper stories of these houses, the day began before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. The light came first to the windows that faced east, then to the roof terraces, and last to the lower windows that faced the street. By the time the lower rooms were lit by direct sun, the household had already been at work for an hour. Bread was the first activity of the morning. The flour, ground the previous evening on the saddle quern that stood beside the kitchen door, was measured into a shallow basin of clay, mixed with water and a portion of leaven kept from the previous day, kneaded on a smooth wooden board, and formed into the round flat loaves that the people of the town baked. The dough rose in covered baskets while the fire was built up in the domed oven set into the kitchen wall. The oven was small, 2 strides across on the inside, and was heated by burning brushwood and olive prunings in the chamber until the inner walls were hot, after which the ash was swept to one side and the loaves placed directly on the floor of the chamber to bake. Water was the second activity. A household kept its drinking water in narrow-necked jugs in the courtyard, drawn from a great pithos that stood in the corner of the courtyard and was filled from the cistern below. The cistern was filled by the winter rains, and a household with care could pass the entire summer from a full winter cistern without recourse to the springs. Water for washing was kept separately in shallower jars and was used and reused. A household began the day washing hands and face and ended the day washing the vessels from the evening meal in the same water, slightly diminished and slightly less clear, but still sufficient to the work. Children rose with the household and were given small tasks. The youngest carried small jugs of water from the courtyard to the upper rooms, returning to fill them again. Older children ground grain on the saddle quern, two-handed, the upper stone working back and forth across the lower stone in a slow rocking motion that left a fine flour at the lower edge. Older still, the children worked beside their parents in the workshops or in the magazines, learning the small skills that built up over the years into the larger skills of the trade. The ground floor workshops opened with the day. A weaver who worked in one of the rooms might have had two looms standing against the wall, upright frames of timber with a heavy beam at the top, and the warp threads weighted with rows of loom weights along the bottom. The loom weights were of clay, sometimes of lead, pierced once and hung in clusters. The weaver passed the weft thread between the warp threads with a wooden shuttle, then drove the weft up against the previous row with a comb of bone or of wood, and the cloth grew row by row from the bottom upward. The cloth that was made was of wool, of linen, and of mixed fiber, dyed in the local pigments and in the imported pigments from farther away, and used for clothing and for trade. A bronze smith who worked in another of the rooms began his day by building up the fire in a small forge of clay set against the back wall. The forge was small, no larger than a household oven, but it could reach the temperature at which bronze would soften and run. The smith worked with imported metal, copper that came in ingots shaped like an ox hide, the corners drawn out as handles for carrying, and tin that came in much smaller quantities, packed in cloth or in leather from sources very far away. The bronze of the town was cast in stone molds and then cold-worked, hammered, drawn, polished, sharpened. Fish hooks, razors, tweezers, awls, small chisels, and the heads of the spears used for hunting on the slopes of the central peak were all made in this way. A potter in another of the rooms turned the wheel by foot, his hands working a lump of clay into the form he intended. The clay was local, dug from a vein in the lower slopes and weathered through the winter before use, mixed with a fine grit of crushed pumice and a small portion of water. The wheel was a heavy disc of fired clay set on a vertical post. The foot turned a lower disc at the base of the post, and the upper disc turned in sympathy. The forms made were the forms that the town used: jugs with narrow necks, cups with single handles, bowls with low rims, plates with shallow profiles. The decoration was matte slip on a paler ground, applied with a brush after the form had been turned and before the firing. The shapes ran to a recognizable house style. The morning passed in the rhythm of these activities. By the time the sun was high enough to throw its light into the lower rooms, the bread had come out of the oven and was set on a rack to cool. The water had been carried. The loom had begun its slow accumulation of cloth. The forge had reached its temperature, and the smith was beginning his first piece, and the potter had set the first finished vessels on the drying rack to wait their turn at the kiln. The street outside filled with the comings and goings of the town, people moving between houses, between the workshops and the magazines, between the upper streets and the lower paths to the harbor. The sounds were the sounds of the trade and the family, low and continuous, neither rising nor falling, but holding through the morning at an even level, until the heat of midday pushed the work into the shaded back rooms. The pottery of the town was its most abundant material. Many thousands of vessels have been recovered from the excavated quarter, ranging from the great storage pithoi of the magazines to the smallest cups of the household. The fabric was fine, the walls thin in proportion to the size of the vessel, the firing even, the slips evenly applied. The decoration ran in three main schemes. Earlier pieces were finished in matte black on a pale ground, with motifs drawn from the natural world, spirals and waves at the rims and shoulders, leaves and flowers around the bellies, animals less frequently, and humans almost never. Mid-period pieces shifted toward a heavier use of red alongside the black, with bands of red ground across the upper third of the vessel, and decoration laid over the bands in a lighter slip. Late pieces carried the most complex decoration, scenes from the natural world drawn in detail, papyrus and lily and crocus and dolphin in repeated patterns around the belly of the vessel. The pithoi were a category of their own. They stood the height of a standing adult, with a body wide enough that a person could not reach across it with arms outstretched, and a rim broad enough to admit a hand and arm with ease. They were built up by coil rather than turned on the wheel, the clay laid down in long sausages around the previous course, the inner and outer surfaces smoothed to a finish before the next course was added. A pithos of this size took weeks to build and days to dry between stages, and was fired in a kiln large enough to admit it whole. The kilns of the town stood on the lower slopes, away from the houses, in clusters of 2 and 3, with their flues drawing upward through the prevailing wind. The largest fired vessels were placed in the deepest part of the chamber, where the fire ran longest at the highest temperature. Stone was the second material of the town. The dressed ashlar of the lower walls came from quarries on the eastern side of the island, where a harder, finer-grained volcanic stone could be cut in regular blocks. The blocks were dressed on 5 faces with bronze chisels and stone hammers, set without mortar in horizontal courses, and the corners squared with a plumb line and a set square. The interior floors of the ground floor rooms were of beaten earth, of plastered earth, or in the better rooms of cut stone slabs laid in regular paving. The thresholds of doorways were of harder stone still, cut with grooves for the wooden door to swing against and for the bolt to drop into. Hearths were lined with stone slabs set on edge, and the cooking surface of the kitchen ovens was a single broad slab dressed flat. Wood was the third material. The town stood on an island that had once been more thickly wooded than the modern landscape suggests. Cypress, juniper, fir, and the wild olive grew on the slopes of the central peak and on the upper terraces. The beams of the houses, the door and window frames, the stair treads, the shutters, the looms, the wheels of the potters, the handles of the tools, the masts and the oars of the boats in the harbor, the kegs in which water was carried, the rakes and the threshing sledges in the fields, all came from this wood. The wood was cut in the late winter, when the sap was down, dressed with a bronze axe, squared with a bronze adze, and planed with a bronze plane. The joints were pegged with hardwood pegs and bound with leather thongs. Bronze itself was scarce. The copper came in ingots from Cyprus and from the Anatolian coast, the tin from a much further distance, possibly from the Central Asian routes or from the western edge of the Mediterranean. The metals were brought together at the local forge and alloyed in the proportion of about 9 parts copper to 1 part tin, with small adjustments depending on the intended use. Hard tools, such as chisels and axe heads and knife blades, took a higher proportion of tin and a heavier hammering after casting. Softer goods, such as pins and hooks and rings and small ornaments, took a lower proportion and a finer surface polish. The total amount of bronze in circulation in the town was modest. Most of the work was done with tools of stone and of wood and of fired clay. Bronze was the metal of the precise edge and the small fastening. Pigment for the frescoes was the 5th material. The earth pigments, the red and yellow ochre and the raw umber and the terra verte, came from the island itself, ground on a stone pallet and mixed with a little lime water to a stiff paste. Lamp black, the deepest black, was scraped from the inside of an oil lamp that had burned for several hours against a curved tile. The brilliant blue, Egyptian blue, came as a powder of crushed and refired glass from Egypt, brought across the sea in small jars and used sparingly because it was costly. The deep red, vermilion, or a close equivalent, came from the burning of ochre to a much higher temperature than the painters could achieve in the town, and was also imported in small quantities. The rarest pigment, the purple drawn from the shell of the murex on the Cretan and Levantine coasts, appears only in a few of the frescoes and only in the smallest passages of the most expensive scenes. The other materials of daily life were the materials of every Bronze Age town. Leather, woven mat, basketry of palm and of reed, cordage of hemp and of flax, bone tools, antler tools, shell ornaments. These materials are less well preserved than the pottery and the stone, but they are present in the assemblage, and the patterns of their use can be read in the impressions they left on the plastered floors and the soft volcanic soil beneath. The town stood on a sea route. To its south, 2 days under a steady wind, lay the great Minoan palaces of Crete, Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, and the smaller harbors and villas that linked them to the coast. To its north, a half-day to a full day, depending on the route, lay the smaller Cycladic islands, and beyond them the long coast of the Greek mainland with its early towns and citadels. To its northeast, 2 days under a fair wind, lay the western coast of Anatolia, with its long-established harbors and its links inland to the great empires of the Bronze Age. To its south and east, 4 to 6 days under a favorable wind, lay Cyprus, the source of the copper that the town's smiths worked into bronze. Farther still, twice the distance of Cyprus, lay the coast of the Levant and beyond it Egypt. The town traded with all of these places. The pattern of imported goods recovered from the excavated houses is rich. Cretan stirrup jars, narrow-necked vessels designed to hold oil or scented oil and to be transported without spillage, appear in the magazines in considerable quantity, both empty and with their original contents preserved as a residue at the bottom. The pottery is Cretan in fabric and in decoration, made on the wheel in a slightly different clay and finished in a slightly different style from the local pottery, and serves as evidence of the close commercial relationship between the town and the southern island. Cypriot copper appears in the form of the oxhide ingot, a flat slab of metal with the 4 corners drawn out into handles, weighing about 30 kilograms apiece, and stamped with marks of origin and weight. Several of these ingots were recovered in the bronzesmith's quarter, partly cut and ready for further reduction. Stone vessels from Crete and from Egypt appear in the houses of the more prosperous quarter. The Cretan vessels are of serpentine and of chlorite, ground and polished to a finished surface. The Egyptian vessels are of alabaster, of porphyry, and of red granite, ground to a much higher polish and bearing in some cases the cartouches of named pharaohs. A single ostrich egg, decorated with a band of painted figures, came from Egypt or from the Levant by way of the Cretan harbors. It was found in fragments on the floor of an upper room of the West House. Faience beads, scarabs, and small amulets of Egyptian or Egyptianizing manufacture appear in the assemblage in numbers sufficient to indicate a regular trade rather than an occasional gift. The town's own products moved outward in return. Wine, in particular, is implied by the great number of pithoi marked with seals associated with viticulture, and by the recovered pollen records that show extensive cultivation of the vine across the lower slopes. Saffron, harvested from the autumn-flowering crocus that grew on the higher slopes of the central peak, is depicted prominently in the frescoes of one of the upper rooms, and its trade across the Aegean is well attested for the period. Olive oil, pressed in the stone basins of several of the excavated houses, would have moved in the narrow-necked jugs that the local potters specialized in producing. Cloth, dyed in the local pigments and woven on the upright looms of the workshops, may have moved outward in significant quantities, though the textiles themselves have not survived to confirm this. The harbor lay directly below the town on a beach of dark sand sheltered by a low, rocky promontory. The boats that called there were of the type depicted in the miniature frieze in the upper room of the West House, long, narrow, decked at the bow and the stern, with a raised vertical post at the prow, and a raised curving post at the stern, propelled by rows of paired oars and by a single square sail set on a vertical mast amidships. The boats were not large by later standards. The largest depicted carry perhaps 30 rowers and a small crew, the smaller, half that. They were drawn up on the beach when not in use, the keel resting on rounded logs that allowed them to be rolled up and down between the water and the dry land. The frieze in the West House shows a procession of these boats moving between two coastal settlements, with details of the rigging, the rowers, the helmsmen, the passengers in their cloaks, and the awnings raised against the sun. The shore in the background is alive with people, figures in long robes watching the boats arrive, animals grazing on the slopes behind, smaller boats at anchor in the shallow water, and the town itself rising in tiers of flat-roofed buildings above the harbor. The scene reads as a celebration of arrival, possibly the arrival of a particular fleet on a particular day, possibly the regular pattern of the trading season at its height. The trade was seasonal. From the late autumn through the early spring, the prevailing winds and the rough water made the open routes difficult. The boats were drawn up on the beach, the magazines filled with the previous year's goods, and the trading networks held themselves in reserve. From the late spring through the early autumn, the routes opened, the boats were launched, and the harbors of the Aegean and beyond filled with traffic. The town's prosperity, evident in the scale of its houses and the quality of its furnishings, depended on this seasonal rhythm and on the position of the town along the principal sea routes of the period. The position was held for several centuries. By late afternoon, the light slanted across the streets at a low angle, and the upper stories of the houses cast deep shadows across the paving and across the open doorways of the workshops below. The day's heat began to drift out of the lower rooms. The looms in the weaver's room had stopped their slow rhythm and stood quiet against the wall, the shuttle resting on the bench, the day's cloth folded and set aside. The forge in the bronze smith's room had cooled to a dull red and was banked with ash for the night. The potter's wheel had stopped, the day's finished vessels were drying on the rack, and the floor had been swept of the day's clay. The workshops emptied. The household drew itself upward into the cooler rooms of the upper stories, where the windows took the last of the light from the western horizon. The men of the household returned from the fields by way of the gates at the edge of the town. Those who had spent the day among the vines came back with pruning hooks of bronze hung at their belts and bundles of cuttings carried in baskets on their shoulders. Those who had spent the day in the barley returned with sheaves of grain or with the implements of the threshing floor. Those who had spent the day at the harbor returned with nets and lines, and the day's catch of fish hung on a pole between two men. The work of the day ended at different times for different households. By the time the sun was a hand's breadth above the western horizon, most of the work in the surrounding fields had stopped, and the paths up the slope toward the town were full of the returning households, making their slow way home. In the upper rooms of the houses, the women of the household had begun the preparation of the evening meal an hour or two before. The fire in the kitchen oven had been built up again. The day's bread had been taken from its rack and warmed on a stone beside the fire, and the pot for the evening's soup or stew had been set on a stone trivet over the flame. The food of the town was simple and substantial. Barley bread, both flat and risen, formed the base of every meal. Pulses, mostly lentils and broad beans and chickpeas and bitter vetch, were cooked in olive oil with onions and garlic and herbs. Fish from the harbor was grilled on flat stones over the embers or cooked in a stew with herbs and oil and a little wine. Olives, both fresh in season and brined the rest of the year, were eaten with every meal. Cheese, made from the milk of goats and sheep grazing on the lower terraces, was eaten fresh in the warmer months and aged in the cooler. Fruit was eaten in season: figs, grapes, pomegranates, mulberries, almonds. The meal was taken in the principal room of the upper story, on low benches or on cushions set on the plastered floor. The benches ran along the walls, plastered and painted in the same colors as the frescoes above. A low table of wood or a row of wooden trays set on the floor held the food. The household ate together, the head of the household at one end of the bench, the children at the other, the women moving between the kitchen and the room to bring more food and to remove the empty vessels. Conversation was quiet. The voices of the household carried out through the open windows and joined the voices of the other households along the street, the whole town humming low at the level of the evening meal. After the meal, the household moved into the lower light. Lamps were lit in the upper rooms, small open dishes of clay or of cut stone with a wick laid in a notch at one end and a charge of olive oil filling the dish. The lamps gave a small steady light, enough to read by if there had been reading, enough to sew by, enough to spin by, enough to talk by. The household sat in the lamplight, the children on the floor or on cushions, the elders on the benches. The day's small repairs were made. A torn garment was mended. A loose handle on a jar was rebound. A broken spindle was carved out of a new piece of wood. The conversation slowed as the evening went on, until the older members of the household began to nod. The children were carried into the side rooms and laid on their mats, and the lamps were extinguished one by one. The streets emptied. The last of the evening's traffic moved between the houses and was gone. The animals in the yard settled themselves for the night. The wind shifted with the cooling of the land, blowing now from the sea instead of from the slopes, and carried into the streets the smell of the harbor below, the seaweed, the dark sand, the wet wood of the boats drawn up on the beach. The sound of the sea, which had been beneath the sound of the town through the day, rose into audibility as the rest of the sound died away. Stars came out above the central peak. The pattern of the constellations turned slowly through the night as it had turned for the people of the town through every night of every season. The watchman at the harbor or at the gate walked his round at a slow pace, his lamp held low, his step soft on the stone of the path. The town slept. The cisterns held their water, the magazines held their grain, the workshops held the day's work, the looms and the forges and the wheels standing quiet in the darkness of the ground floor rooms. By midnight all the lamps were out. By the small hours only the sound of the sea remained. In several of the larger houses of the excavated quarter, the principal upper room contained a sunken chamber, square in plan, reached by a short flight of stone steps from the level of the surrounding floor. The chamber was small, about 3 strides on a side, and the walls were finished in the finest plaster of any room in the house, painted from the floor to the ceiling in scenes whose meaning the modern observer can read only in part. These rooms are referred to in the archaeological literature as lustral basins, a term that may or may not describe their original use. They appear elsewhere in the Aegean world of the period, in the Cretan palaces and in some of the larger villas, and their distribution suggests that they served a function shared across the Minoan and Cycladic cultures, rather than a function particular to any one settlement. The frescoes in the lustral basin of the house known as Geste III are among the most complete that survive from the Bronze Age Aegean. On one wall, a procession of young women in long pleated robes moves toward a seated figure on a stepped platform. In their hands and in the baskets they carry, they bring crocus flowers, the same autumn blooming flower that grew and still grows on the higher slopes of the central peak. The seated figure is larger than the figures in the procession and is flanked by a monkey and a griffin. The figure has been variously interpreted as a goddess receiving offerings as a high-ranking woman of the town receiving the produce of the harvest, and as a composite ritual figure standing for both readings together. The scene reads as a ceremony of the saffron, the central agricultural product of the autumn season, transferred from the field to a receiver who blesses or accepts the harvest. On another wall of the same room, 3 female figures of different ages are shown together. The youngest, a child, is being undressed or dressed by an older companion. The oldest, a fully mature woman, stands at one side. The scene has been read as a coming-of-age ceremony, or as a sequence representing the stages of female life. The hair of the figures is dressed differently for each age. The child wears a single lock at the side of an otherwise shaven head. The adolescent wears a longer lock with the rest of the hair grown out. The adult wears the hair gathered and bound. The treatment of the hair is consistent across the surviving frescoes of the town, and may indicate that the hairstyles of women in the town's society reflected the same stages of life that the frescoes depicted. On the opposite wall, a procession of male figures moves in a similar pattern. The youngest of them, again with the shaven head and the single lock, are shown carrying offerings. The older are shown in longer robes and with the hair bound. Whatever the precise nature of the ceremony, the parallel structure of the male and female processions on opposite walls of the same room suggests a ritual that involved both sexes at corresponding stages of life, and that probably marked transitions of social status. No temple has been identified in the excavated quarter. There is no large public building set apart for religious use. There is no shrine on a hilltop, no altar in a public square, no enclosure that can be read unambiguously as a sacred precinct. What the excavation has revealed is a pattern in which the sacred space is distributed through the domestic architecture, embedded in the upper rooms of the larger houses, accessible only to the household that lived there and to those whom the household received. This pattern is consistent with what is known of Minoan religion from Crete: the absence of monumental temples, the presence of small sacred spaces within palatial and domestic complexes, the use of natural settings as additional sites of religious activity, the caves and the mountain peaks and the sacred groves of the Cretan landscape. The objects associated with the lustral basins, where they have been recovered intact, are modest. Small libation vessels of clay and stone, finely worked but not lavishly decorated. A few figurines, again small, of human and animal form, of clay and of bronze and of stone. The basins themselves were not constructed to hold standing water. The plastered surface of their floors is the same as the plastered surface of the surrounding rooms, with no provision for drainage and no impermeable lining. Whatever was performed in them did not involve immersion in any quantity of water. The name lustral basin reflects an early interpretation by the original excavators of the Cretan examples that the rooms were used for ritual washing or purification. The term has stayed in use, even though the evidence is consistent with several other interpretations, and even though no clear evidence of water use has been recovered. What can be said with confidence is that these rooms were spaces of heightened ceremony, that they were positioned at the architectural and visual focus of the houses that contained them, that their decoration was the most elaborate in the building, and that they were accessible only by the formal route of the stair from the principal room above. The household that built such a room invested considerable resources in its construction and decoration. The frescoes on the walls of Zesteth III alone occupied a team of trained painters for many weeks, with materials including the imported Egyptian blue that was the most expensive pigment available in the Bronze Age Aegean. The ceremony, whatever its precise content, was important enough to justify this investment. Beyond the lustral basins themselves, the houses of the town held smaller traces of ritual activity. Niches built into the walls for the placement of small figurines or vessels, painted scenes of flowers and birds that may have had a votive significance, single conical cups of a kind known to have been used in libation across the Minoan world. The religious life of the town was woven into the fabric of the houses and the daily rhythm of the households. The site does not preserve a separate priestly quarter or a separate religious architecture. The pattern is still legible. The year on the island moved through a small set of certainties. The autumn began in late September, with the first rains coming in from the west and breaking the long, dry heat of the summer. The autumn was the season of the olive. The trees on the terrace slopes around the town began to drop their fruit in late October, and the harvest ran from then through the middle of December. The olives were collected by hand from the ground, or knocked down with long poles into nets spread beneath the trees, and were carried in baskets to the stone presses set into the lower rooms of the larger houses. The presses were of two parts: a flat circular basin of cut stone set into the floor, with a low rim and a spout at one edge for the oil to run out, and a heavy upper stone or wooden beam lowered onto the layer of crushed olives spread across the basin to extract the oil. The oil ran out through the spout into a series of settling jars, where the oil rose and the bitter water sank, and was then drawn off into the storage jars in the magazines. The first pressing of the season, made from the firmest fruit and pressed with the least force, produced the finest oil. Subsequent pressings, made from softer fruit and with heavier force, produced oil of declining quality, used for lamps and for soap making and for export. The autumn was also the season of the saffron. The crocus that produced the saffron flowered on the higher slopes of the central peak in late October, in fields that were tended through the summer for the autumn bloom. The flowers were picked at first light, when the petals were still closed and the stigmas inside were at their freshest, and were brought down the slope to the town in baskets. In the upper rooms of the houses involved in the trade, women separated the 3 red stigmas from each flower by hand and laid them on flat plates to dry. The yield was very small. A field of considerable size produced only a few pounds of saffron in a season. The dried stigmas were stored in small sealed jars in the magazines, alongside the pithoi of oil and wine, and moved into the export trade in the following spring. The winter began with the rains and ran from December through February. The winter was the season of the indoor work. The boats were drawn up on the beach, and the sails and rigging were taken into the storage rooms for repair. The looms in the upper rooms ran longer hours, the women of the household spinning and weaving through the short days and the long evenings. The bronze smiths repaired tools that had worn during the agricultural year. The carpenters cut new beams and shaped new handles. The potters built up their stocks of finished vessels for the coming season of trade. The barley and the emmer, sown in the autumn, were already in the ground. The vines, pruned in early winter, stood bare on their terraces. The olive trees, after the harvest, were given over to the rest of the year. The streets of the town were quieter in the winter than at any other season. The sound of the rain on the roof terraces, the sound of the sea below the cliffs, the sound of the wind across the upper windows, all became prominent. The spring began in early March, with the lengthening of the days and the appearance of the first new growth on the slopes. The spring was the season of the lambs. The flocks of sheep and goats on the lower terraces produced their young in March and April, and the work of the shepherds doubled with the new births. The spring was also the season of the first sailings. As the sea calmed and the prevailing winds settled into the patterns of the warm months, the boats were launched again, the rigging was set, and the first trading expeditions of the year departed for the southern harbors. The town's harbor filled with traffic, both outgoing and incoming, and the magazines began to release the year's stored goods into the trade. The spring frescoes that survive in some of the houses show fields of red lilies in bloom against the dark slopes, swallows arriving and departing in the open air, the new growth of the season laid out across the walls of the upper rooms. The summer was long and hot and dry. The summer was the season of the barley and the emmer harvest. The grain ripened in early June, was cut with bronze sickles, gathered into sheaves, and carried to the threshing floors set on the higher ground at the edge of the town. The threshing was done with sledges drawn by oxen and weighted with stones, dragged in a slow circle around the floor over the spread sheaves, breaking the grain from the chaff. The grain was then winnowed, tossed into the air with wooden forks in a stiff breeze, so that the lighter chaff blew away and the heavier grain fell back to the floor. The grain was carried to the magazines in the houses and poured into the pithoi for storage through the year. The summer was also the season of the longest trading voyages. The boats that departed in early summer for the harbors of Cyprus or the Levant did not return until the early autumn. The 4 seasons turned upon one another in the same order through every year of the town's principal occupation, with small variations of weather and of yield, but with the same broad pattern across the centuries. The town's prosperity rested on this rhythm. The dry summers produced the oil and the wine. The wet winters produced the water and the new growth. The spring and the autumn produced the major transitions between the indoor and the outdoor life. The houses and the workshops and the magazines were organized to fit this rhythm, and the people of the town moved through the year along its long, slow turn. Sometime in the 17th century, before the present era, the central peak of the island began to register the activity that would eventually empty the town. The first signs were the earthquakes, a series of seismic events, gradual at first and then more intense, ran through the town and damaged buildings across the excavated quarter. Walls cracked, plaster fell from the upper rooms, floors heaved, door frames warped out of true. The inhabitants made repairs where the damage was light. Wall cracks were patched with fresh plaster, fallen ceilings were rebuilt with new beams, broken pottery was swept up, and the largest pieces were used to level the floors of the magazines. In some houses, the repairs were extensive. In others, the damage was beyond easy repair, and the rooms were left. A pattern of stacked debris appears in several of the streets and in the courtyards of the houses, dating from this period. Piles of broken pottery, broken plaster, broken stone, set aside in the corners of the open spaces and at the bases of the walls. The piles indicate cleaning rather than abandonment. The inhabitants were not throwing rubble out of windows. They were sweeping their houses, stacking the debris for later disposal, and continuing to live in the buildings as best they could. The repairs continued through what appears to have been a period of weeks or months of low-level seismic activity. The town held. Then a larger event occurred. The exact sequence is reconstructed from the archaeological record and from the geological record of the eruption that followed, but the broad outline is clear. A sustained period of more intense earthquakes followed the first phase, sufficient to damage even the heaviest construction of the town. The inhabitants began to move out. The pattern of finds across the houses indicates that this was an orderly evacuation rather than a sudden abandonment. The household goods were largely removed. Furniture, bedding, jewelry, the finer pottery, and the more portable wealth of the household were carried away. The pithoi in the magazines were too heavy to move and were left in place, mostly empty or with their lower contents still inside. The workshops were stripped of their tools. The looms were broken down and the weights left in heaps where the looms had stood. The bronze tools and weapons were largely taken. No human remains have been recovered in the excavated area. The point bears emphasis. Other archaeological sites destroyed by eruption, Pompeii most famously, yield the bodies of the inhabitants caught by the event. Akrotiri does not. The town was empty when the eruption sealed it. The inhabitants had recognized the warning of the prolonged earthquake activity and had departed, presumably by boat, presumably for the southern coast of Crete or for one of the other Cycladic islands. Where they went is not certainly known. Their fate is not certainly known. What is known is that they did not die in the town. The interval between the abandonment of the town and the principal eruption is also not certainly known. It may have been days, it may have been weeks, it may have been longer. The geological record indicates that the eruption began with a phase of falling ash that covered the abandoned town in a deepening blanket of pumice and fine particles. The first layer is uniform across the site, indicating still air during the deposit. The layer is thick enough to suggest that the falling material continued for some hours or some days. Above this layer, the deposit becomes more complex, phases of explosive activity alternating with phases of pyroclastic flow, until the entire town and the surrounding terraces were buried beneath several meters of volcanic material. The eruption itself was of considerable magnitude. The geological record indicates an event of approximately the same scale as the Tambora eruption of the early 19th century of the present era, or possibly larger. The volume of erupted material was on the order of 60 cubic kilometers. The central cone of the island was destroyed and the surrounding ridges collapsed inward, forming the open caldera that fills the modern view to the north of the town. The volcanic ash spread widely across the Aegean and the eastern Mediterranean and is detectable as a distinct layer in sediment cores across an area of several 100,000 square kilometers. The effects on the climate, recorded in tree ring records and in ice cores from polar regions, indicate a period of cooler temperatures and disrupted weather patterns lasting several years. The town was not reoccupied. The volcanic deposits over it were too deep, and the harbor below it had been carried away by the collapse of the ridge. The other settlements of the island, where they had existed, were also buried. The entire population, those who had not departed earlier, were gone. The Minoan civilization on Crete continued for another century or more, but the Cycladic settlements that had been part of the same network entered a period of reduced activity from which they did not fully recover during the Bronze Age. The town remained beneath its blanket of volcanic material for approximately 35 centuries. Through the long centuries, the inhabitants of the island, when there were again inhabitants on the island, lived above it without knowing it was there. The dark soil that covered it produced its own crops in time. The new villages rose and fell on the ground above, and the slow erosion of the volcanic deposits laid down by the eruption returned the slopes to a habitable form. The original town held its shape beneath, unbroken in most places, the pumice having packed evenly around the standing walls and held them in place at their full height. The plaster on the walls retained the pigment of its frescoes. The door frames and the window frames of cypress and of fir, sealed from oxygen by the fine ash, retained their original form. The town was held in a state that very few archaeological sites have ever been held in. The site is still there. The city is not. The excavated quarter now stands beneath a wide steel and fabric roof, a short walk from the modern village of Akrotiri at the southern end of Santorini. The roof, designed in the early years of the 21st century of the present era, replaces an earlier shelter that collapsed in 2005 and is now the principal protection for the site from the elements. It admits a soft, even light through translucent panels in its upper surface, and its frame allows the visitor to walk the original streets of the town at the original level, with the original walls rising on either side. The shelter covers approximately 3 hectares, somewhat larger than the excavated area itself, and leaves open at the lower ends a view through to the modern landscape beyond. The dark slopes of the southern part of the island, the line of the modern road, the white houses of the village on the higher ground. Inside the shelter, the walls of the Bronze Age houses rise to their original heights in many places, sometimes to a full 2 stories and in places to 3. The window frames remain in place, the wooden lintels having been preserved in a state of carbonized integrity by the volcanic ash, and replaced for safety in the modern conservation by reconstructions that follow the original dimensions exactly. The door frames are similarly preserved or reconstructed. The stairs of cut stone rise from the ground floor rooms to the upper stories, with their original treads still in place. The stairs of timber in the upper portions have been replaced by modern reconstructions that follow the surviving evidence. The visitor walking through the site moves along the original paving stones of the original streets, between the original walls at the original level. The frescoes have been removed for conservation. The original wall paintings, including the procession of the saffron gatherers, the female figures of the 3 ages, the spring landscape of the red lilies and the swallows, and the miniature frieze of the boats and the harbors, are displayed in the Museum of Prehistoric Thera in the modern town of Thera, on the northern part of the island, and in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. The walls in the original rooms from which the frescoes were removed are now plain. Some rooms have been fitted with reconstruction images of the frescoes at the original scale, mounted on the walls in their original positions. Others have been left as the bare plaster the painters originally laid down. The harbor below the town is no longer there. The collapse of the ridge during the eruption carried the harbor, the beach, the promontory, and a portion of the lower ridge into the sea, and replaced them with the deep water and the steep cliffs of the modern caldera. The view from the upper rooms of the houses, which once took in the harbor and the line of the moored boats and the open water beyond, now looks across to the steep cliffs of the modern caldera and the high ridge of the modern village of Thera, 3 kilometers distant across the water. The light on this view is different from the light on the original view. The water is closer into the cliffs and falls into shadow earlier in the day. The cliffs themselves rise sheer and dark from the water, with the lines of the volcanic deposits running across them in horizontal bands. The site is excavated by the archaeologists of the Archaeological Society of Athens and by the Greek Ministry of Culture in continuous campaigns that have run since 1967, when Spiridon Marinatos opened the first systematic trenches. The excavation has proceeded slowly. Only a small portion of the total area of the ancient town has been uncovered. The rest remains beneath the deep volcanic deposits, awaiting future work. The total area of the Bronze Age town has been estimated at 20 hectares or more, of which the excavated quarter represents perhaps 1/10. The remaining buildings, the public spaces, the workshops on the periphery, the harbor installations, the cemeteries themselves, all remain to be investigated. The visitor who walks the site today moves along a network of raised walkways set above the original paving, designed to allow the public access without wearing the original surfaces. The walkways pass through the streets, over the rooftops where the upper stories have been preserved, beside the magazines with their pithoi still in place, and beside the workshops with the impressions of the original looms and forges still visible on the floors. Each major area is labeled in Greek and in English with the name given to it by the excavators: West House, House of the Ladies, Zeste 3, Zeste 4, House Beta, and so on. The labels are discreet. The lighting is low. The shelter is engineered to maintain a stable temperature and humidity, and to admit only as much external light as is needed for the visitor to see clearly. In the late afternoon, the light passes through the lower openings of the shelter at an angle, and the dark volcanic soil takes on the color of bronze. The air inside the shelter, cooled by the shade and steadied by the engineering, holds the same low murmur it has held all day. The visitors move quietly along the walkways. The town beneath them holds its original walls, its original streets, its original storage jars, its original window frames, in a state of preservation that no other Bronze Age town has reached. Outside the shelter, the modern village and the modern road continue their slow afternoon. Beyond them, the open caldera shines under the slanting light. The sea is dark in the deep water, the sky pales above the ridge to the north. The day continues its long descent toward evening, and the site holds beneath its roof, its walls standing as they stood before the ash came down. The stones remain.